welcome back. We're here with Pastor David Syme, who, David, you were one of the founders of the Adventist Development and Relief Agency, and you've had many years of experience with ADRA through the world in multiple divisions of the General Conference, and developed a lot of the policy of ADRA. And I'm interested because one of the critiques of the work of a Christian organisation as a humanitarian aid organisation is that it has an agenda attached to its good work. That Christianity is there not simply to do good, but to gain converts.
Exactly.
You know what I?
Yes.
And so I wonder, in your experience, your life experience, and then in your work with ADRA, how do you reflect upon that kind of a critique?
It's a really important question. And again, the answer, I think, can be direct, and yet at the same time, it is stronger in some cultures than others.
Okay.
So, globally, looking at it as a whole. But I think there's a basic principle that we must understand, and I'm going to demonstrate that by a story.
Okay, yes.
So when I was in America one winter in Washington, D.C., it was bitterly cold. I was invited to an evening at a church in downtown Washington. When I went down there to see the program, there was a preacher, and a lot of homeless people were sitting in the seats listening to the preacher preach. Okay. Then there was a kitchen with a lot of hot soup and some other food to eat. And their idea was that we preach to them, and then they are entitled to get some soup and some bread for the hungry.
Right.
So there's a string attached to getting the food.
I see.
Historically, for instance, if you go to the country of Peru, you'll find there that many of the large churches, and there's a strong Catholic history there because of the Spanish and the Portuguese, you will find that the churches originally were built with a large yard in front of the church, which was the marketplace of the village or the community. And that if they could only put up their shop and sell if they'd been to Mass. So similar kind of thing over time. And I think if you followed any denomination, you would find that kind of approach that has been there. And that's kind of puts it in a nutshell is, can you use doing good in that way in order to achieve another thing? There's a difference between using it in that way and when we actually look at the results.
Okay.
Because we even, not so long ago, I went back to West Africa. And during that time, we deliberately had some evangelistic campaigns that were being done by the church. At the same time, ADRA had been working in these communities. And as ADRA worked in the communities doing their good work, more people said, why do you do this, what you do? And we say, well, we do it because we love God and we believe we should give God's love to others. But then they, of their own volition, choose to go and listen to the church. So where these two ministries, I call one declaration, the declaration of the gospel. Should we be declaring the gospel? Absolutely. It's fundamental to Scripture. But we sometimes miss the other aspect, which also exists not above or below, but alongside and necessary, and that is for Christians to live their life in the way that God wants them to live it.
Which you call demonstration.
And that is the demonstration factor.
Right.
And so when those two have a synergy between them, but they're not dependent upon each other, you don't say, oh, unless they come to church, we're not going to put an ADRA program. It's the other way around. We always start with the needs and what have you. Right now, in Bairnsdale, for instance, post-COVID, ADRA is running large for the community. During COVID and before the drought, ADRA was the primary supplier of extra food to the community. It's still doing that. It's doing the same in Melbourne. In those settings, it was needed to be done. It was done in that way, and there was no declaration that was preaching at them while we were giving them the food, or making one dependent upon the other. But what we've seen after post-COVID, that as that love and that the respect that people have because ADRA did that, now the pastor tells me there are people who are coming to him and saying, I never really thought much about Christianity before, but what you guys have done has made a huge difference to our lives. We'd like to know more about it. I think that's a very natural response. If people have done good for you, then you want to know why. We seek reasons in our culture, and so that is one of them. And so obviously we're happy to share, but one is not dependent upon the other. That is the big issue. And all too often when that happens, you can have a real disaster on your hands. So the two must fit nicely together.
Demonstration can lead to declaration.
Yes, it can.
But declaration shouldn't be conditional for
No,
demonstration.
No, exactly. So what happened, for instance, going back to the Peru example, in the Peru example, what happened was then there were some other missionaries who came and said to the people, you don't need to go to mass in order to get food. This is bad. This isn't what the Bible teaches. And so that gradually started to change. So I'm talking about real history, 100 years ago. And so, but now it's changed very much to the other way round. But keeping a balance between the two is really critical, because if you are just doing good, but you don't have a sense of the God of goodness and love. And this raises what we talk about in terms of agape love.
So what do you mean by that?
Okay, agape is a Greek word, and it means sacrificial love. Love that is given without any strings attached, love that is given out of love for the other individual, and it is given with, in loving sacrifice, which is what God in Christian belief did with his son Jesus.
Sure.
And that's what we believe. And so in that setting, for God so loved, agape love, the world, that he gave his only begotten son. And so agape love in the Greek, there have 4 words at least in Greek for love. I won't go through them all, but the reality is we've only got 1 word for love. And so that's why we add the agape, because love sometimes is giving gifts to other people, or it's saying a nice thing or what have you. But agape love is given when one person, through the leading of God in their lives, feels that they should respond to a human's need, whatever it may be. And what is not often understood is that love is always sacrificial.
It costs something.
It costs something, yeah. There is a cost to being a Christian. There is a cost to having faith. There's a famous book written called The Cost of Discipleship.
Okay.
How does this work? okay, I can go and do something. For instance, let me give you an example. During the Rwandan genocide, when it was announced, one of my directors, the director of ADRA Rwanda, was there.
Wow.
And our policy was get out.
Okay.
Because of the genocide, rightly so. And as an organization, we have to say get out to protect the family and what have you. I found after a couple of days that he had sent his wife and children out on the last convoy, but he had stayed. But at the same time, I'm his regional director. And he is there in a very dangerous situation in the middle of a genocide, and his families are in Nairobi, and I was operating our overall program from Nairobi at that time. So I had his wife and children, Teresa and the kids, there, and they'd talk to their dad on the radio and what have you. But then one day the radio stopped, and we didn't know why. And the United Nations didn't know why. They hadn't been into the place where he was living with people from both ethnic groups, protecting them, as well as protecting an orphanage and delivering food to a Catholic monastery where there were other people and what have you. And this man, Carl Wilkins, he's written a book called I'm Not Going to Leave. And in that, he decided that God had called him there, and that if he was going to minister, he was ministering to people, God had called him and God hadn't told him to go. So the organization is saying, get out, go. And he's saying, no, God called me here. I've taken my family away, but I am ready to take on the risk, real risk of not going, because I believe I'm doing God's work.
Right.
Yeah. Tremendous example.
Of agape love.
Yes, of agape love. So again, I'm facing the dilemma. I've been told by both the General Conference and the division where I'm working, I'm not to set foot in Rwanda, because they know I'm the kind of person who might do that. But I went to Nairobi, and when I was there, I couldn't in all conscience, seeing his family there, I couldn't in all conscience say, David, you've got to go over there. So I decided, and I was about to fly on the UN plane, and it was hit by a shell in the fighting, and it took another 10 days before I could. No, it was just wounded by it. And anyway, I went 10 days later on the same plane, a C-130, and flew in. That was a journey of itself, flying at about 450 kilometers an hour, 500 feet above Lake Victoria and up the valleys. It's pretty exciting if you want an adrenaline rush. But anyway, when I got there, I went to the UN, and the UN didn't know where Carl was. And I tried to explain where the house was, and the house where he was staying, protecting these people, was between the rebels coming in to try and overthrow, and the existing government who were carrying out the genocide. And his house was stuck right in the middle. So after 3 days, we got in. There was a lull in the fighting. We had to talk our way past 5 inter-Hamwe checkpoints where they were all armed and ready to kill, and many of them were just young people who had been threatened in this way. If you don't do this, we'll kill you. It was a terrible situation. But anyway, we went in with batteries and flak jackets and mobile walkie-talkies so that they could keep contact. And I took my everlasting camera in to make a movie for ADRA, the one in... So when we finally arrived, of course, he was surprised. He had no idea. We came out, and he invited me in. The UN went, and the driver who had driven me in was hit by a shell on the way out and died.
Tragic. Wow.
So then the UN wouldn't come there anymore. So I'm
you're
stuck
both there
with
on your
him.
own.
My idea, I had rung Elizabeth, my wonderful rock and wife in Abidjan, and I said, you know where I am, because the people had come to her and said, do you know, where's David? You know, he hasn't gone to Rwanda, has he? And she said, David will do what needs to be done. And so she wouldn't answer them. And so my idea was that I would stay behind and let Carl out so he could be with his family. So we'd maintain that. So we took ADRA signs, we took UN signs, we got everything working. Carl was able to talk to his family, which was a tremendous relief for him. So I was there about a week. We slept in the hall under mattresses, not on top of them, because of the flying glass. All the windows had to be open most of the time. Some of them you couldn't open because of flying glass from the aerial bombardment that's going over. And God had a safety mechanism for us. I was sitting at the table the first day having breakfast, what there was to eat. And beside us was a parrot called Masuku. Masuku means bird in Swahili. I'm not sure what his real name was, but anyway, he was there, a grey and red parrot. And all of a sudden, he fell off the perch onto the floor. And everyone dived under the table, and I followed them. And then a shell exploded outside. So this bird could actually hear the vibrations or what of the shell.
That's amazing.
And was our kind of early warning system for what would happen. Anyway, to cut a long story short, Carl felt he needed to stay. And now he'd reestablished contact and he was safer because people could see he was under UN protection, even though there was no UN protection actually there in that area. So he was much safer off. And I had to walk out through all this stuff to the airport because they wouldn't come and get me.
Wow.
But anyway, I was filming Carl with my little Sony High 8 camera, and it had a handle with, on the top was an on-off button, and then in front of it, behind it was a zoom button. So I was filming him when all of a sudden there was a crack and an AK-47 bullet came through the window, knocked the plastic on and off switch on my camera. My hand was just underneath it and hit the wall. And so it was a stray bullet. They weren't shooting at us, but it was a stray bullet that happened. So again, God protected us, in this situation. But I mean, finally, Carl stayed the whole 100 days there. And the organization wasn't happy because they felt that he had compromised their situation. And as an administrator, I understand that, absolutely. But the realities were that sometimes some religious disobedience, maybe call it, is called for because ultimately we believe that it is God that has called us, not the organization. So the organization definitely has responsibilities, no question. But in this setting for him, and certainly for myself, in that setting, we were exercising the right to be different and follow what we felt God was calling us to do. And that meant there was risk, and we faced risk. I faced risk when I walked out. Carl's seat in his car had 2 bullets right through the seat. He wasn't driving at the time when they came, but those were realities when people were being slaughtered by their thousands. But it was the right thing to do, and it was a great demonstration of love. All the diplomats had left. He was apart from one man in the International Council of the Red Cross, who I took a water pump to when I flew in for him as well. the two of them stayed the whole life of the thing.
Wow.
And he was rewarded by a medal in Washington, D.C. 10 years later, for the sacrifices that he made there. Wonderful guy. So that's been part of my experience, and why I think that we need to recognize that when we do give agape love, there is no assurance that nothing is going to happen to you. There's another story of another time where I went and the roof collapsed under me, and I have a prosthesis in this arm to prove it. But that's a story for another time. But there are risks involved. God doesn't promise when you engage in doing the work that is necessary that you've got absolute protection. Things happen in life. Why? Not because God does evil. He doesn't. But there is evil in the world, and it manifests itself in different ways, in different places at different times. And you have to recognize that if you are doing proper agape love, you will be under attack one way or the other.
It is costly, agape love.
It is costly.
But
Dietrich Bonhoeffer was the man who wrote that book, The Cost of Discipleship.
Right.
Wonderful. He was shot by Hitler at the end of the war, but a wonderful man who really understood what the gospel was, what the gospel does for us, and how in being disciples we must follow come what may.
And it's a daunting concept until we see God at work in our lives, preparing us and enabling us to meet that cost.
Do you think you've had that experience?
Yeah, I think so. In small ways.
You want to share with me?
I have to think about it. I see it in the day-to-day.
Yeah.
Let me give you an example. This is a recent reflection that I was having. In my recent experience, agape love has looked like the giving of time, which is something that you actually mentioned in a previous episode, David, was that, to build relationships, you have to invest time, and time is costly, isn't it? And I've noticed recently in my profession as a counselling therapist, the busier that I get, the less effective I become in helping other people when I feel like at a moment's notice I might be called upon to give of my time to someone else. And so I have recognized that in order to show love, it comes at a cost to myself, to what I've got going on, and it requires me to let go of some of the self-centeredness that I have, slow down, and give of myself in order to love effectively.
I think it is ultimately, in Christian belief, it is that which can change the world. But we're living in a world in which many of those qualities that we might call even values that people hold, whether they have a faith or not, about relationships, about community, about the solidity of family, interaction with others, multiracial capacity to deal with different people from different places. All of those things we're losing. And I hope the day won't come when we're just AI robotics.
And the other thing with the cost of love is that it's not only a cost, there's a huge reward that we experience, a fulfilling life that comes when we prepared to sacrifice things that we might hold dear or value for the sake of others.
Absolutely.
Thank you for sharing.
Thank you for sharing.